but where we've been seeing people more in person, which is great. We also provide legal advocacy services, which work with folks who have a really varied list of legal concerns, folks who are interested in getting a restraining order and what the criminal process looks like and what the civil process might look like if they wanted to sue someone civilly for harm that was done to them. We've worked with people who are concerned about their immigration status in the wake of experiencing an assault. So that's a really, really broad spectrum of legal expertise that gets represented within the legal advocacy department. And then we also have a fantastic case management program that works with folks who've been financially impacted by sexual violence. And we look at that very holistically. It could be somebody who is, looking to get into a new apartment, somebody who's looking to move in the wake of an assault, somebody who needs their phone replaced if it got damaged during an assault, or someone who's maybe even looking to go back to school after they dropped out in the wake of an experience of sexual violence. So there's a really across the board holistic approach to what the case management department does. So that's a little bit about us, about our different programming. I would love if you'd like now to unmute yourselves if you care to, or you could drop anything in the chat, any questions you have about BARCC, how it functions, or what services it provides. I would be happy to answer. We'll take just a couple of minutes to answer any questions. There's a great question in the chat. How many volunteers do we have? Right now, we've got about 200 who are active monthly. Hotline volunteers have a shift a week. Web chat volunteers have a shift a week. Incarcerated survivor support volunteers take a shift a week. And the medical advocacy team all take a shift a week. But the length of those shifts varies. Phone hotline shifts are short because those tend to be about 2 to 3 hours because there are a lot of calls that get jammed into that time frame. Medical advocacy shifts tend to be the longest because we're just not seeing the same amount of volume that we used to. I'm sure as that changes and people are perhaps more comfortable getting support in emergency rooms again, we'll see more. And so we are going to slowly have to start building up the numbers of those programs again. And then our web chat and the incarcerated survivor support hotline also have pretty long shifts. Since they just don't get the same kind of volume that the phone hotline does. That program, I would say the phone hotline has more volunteers and more volume than all the other volunteer programs put together. It's really, really busy. Another great question, how long is the training process to become a counselor? What's ongoing volunteer hour requirement? The work sounds amazing, thanks so much. The training process for every rape crisis counselor, be it an intern, a staff member, or a direct service volunteer, is 40 hours long. And so you start off by submitting an application. If you're selected to interview, we interview folks. Now that we're doing all training remote, it's been an amazing ride to see our volume go from 40 to 50 applications where people are interested in being interviewed when the time comes to hundreds of people interested in being interviewed. So that's been tricky to navigate for sure. But the first step is to submit an application, do an interview, and then get selected for the program that you're interviewing for. People don't hop around between them. If you're a hotliner, you stick with that program. If you're a med ed, you stick with med ed program, etc. Then the ongoing requirement for hours, depending on the program you're in, you take a shift a week. So again, if you're a med ed, shift's a little longer, but you're not going to go out on a case every week. Hotline shifts are shorter, but you're going to get some calls every single week. For medical advocacy, you've got to be available to go out in the Boston area. Of course, we'll see what happens with Delta if we have to return to telemedicine. But we're also planning for us to be back in person as much as possible. For the hotline right now, it can really kind of be anywhere because hotliners have always taken their hotline shifts remotely from their homes. We do, however, for all programs require 2 peer supervisions a month, 90 minutes each. So that's an extra 3 hours, basically the equivalent from some programs of an extra shift a week, or an extra shift a month. And those are the hourly requirements for volunteering. We also ask for folks to stick with us for a calendar year. There's so much training that goes into training someone to be a rape crisis counselor, and so much ongoing supervision that we ask for a year-long commitment. What kind of background is needed to volunteer, if any? I love this question. I get asked this all the time in my work. It's one of my very favorites. I would say that the background of being a warm, empathetic 18-plus-year-old is really the only background you need. All the programs take folks of all genders. All of the programs have amazing volunteers who are from all different academic and professional backgrounds, or neither. Really, what makes a really successful volunteer to me is someone who can fulfill the logistical requirements and have a little time left over to take care of themselves. If you're really trying to, fit it in with a really packed schedule, we definitely see people start to really feel the strain because it's very stressful work. I would also say someone who's open to empowerment is incredibly important. I think understandably, folks have really strong feelings about sexual violence, about how it's handled by individuals and by our culture. Being a rape crisis counselor, a lot of it is kind of about letting that go in the moment and just supporting the person you're working with and talking to them about what their needs are and doing the best you can to figure out a way for them to get the most of what they want to happen next. And that can be really tough. It can be hard for me after 10 years of being at BARCC. And then I would say the last thing that we see where folks are really successful is openness to learning. I think when folks come in sometimes with a client service background or legal background, that can be incredible. But I think you also have to be really open to the context in which you're doing this work. Being a clinician and being a hotline counselor really looks so different. So if you've never done this work before, or if you've been doing something similar for many years, in both cases, you've got to just be open to learning through the training and through the ongoing supervision. For the Incarcerated Survivor Support Program, does BARCC offer legal advice to the survivors or just support services? That is a great question. We typically cannot provide services to somebody who is currently incarcerated. The exceptions are when somebody's rights are being violated. So if somebody were to call us and say, I've been convicted of drug possession and I'm not guilty, I need your lawyers to help get me out. That's just not something that we would have expertise in knowing how to do. But if somebody reached out and said to us, my rights are being violated in prison, I'm not being cared for, I'm not being protected, I'm experiencing sexual violence, or I have experienced sexual violence, that's definitely something we could work with our legal team to try to intervene with, for sure. But definitely when somebody is incarcerated, the number of services available to them are much, much less than folks who are not incarcerated. Does someone need to be within a certain distance of the Boston area to be able to turn to BARCC for support? Really, no. We don't get anybody's zip code to see if we can give them services. And especially now that we're providing remote services, it's just not as relevant. But I remember when we were in person back in the, quote unquote, olden days, people used to drive from Maine to get counseling, to get free counseling at BARCC because they didn't want to go close to their house. And also maybe there weren't any services close to their house. We didn't care if they lived in another state. We wanted to just support them. There are times though when folks will want resources and we're not the best place because we don't have geographically, it doesn't make sense. If somebody's looking to prosecute the person who harmed them in Idaho, we can provide them with counseling if they're here in Boston, but we don't know the legal system. We don't have connections in Idaho. We don't have all of that information. So we're going to make a referral to another resource. But again, like I said earlier with the hotline, people we know call us from all over the world, and we're just happy to support folks. And then the last question I see here, a great one to end on, is do you work with domestic violence agencies if they need to get out of the home? For sure, domestic violence agencies are some of the most valuable partnerships that we have because so many domestic violence situations have a component of sexual violence to them. And we know that there are a lot of folks who, even though we say we're the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center, we do a lot of work with folks who might not consider themselves in active crisis. And it's very common for people to reach out to, say, a DV agency, leave their home, go to a place that's safe, and at perhaps a later date, want counseling, want legal advocacy, want case management, want some support that BARCC can provide. It's often said, and I don't think it's really true, it's certainly not true for every individual, but it's often said that sexual violence is sometimes the last thing that a domestic violence survivor will talk about. That's something that's so private and really intimate. And also a lot of DV survivors I've heard say took a long time for them to realize that there was a sexual violence component to their relationships, that they thought that this was just the way it was supposed to be. And looking back, they realized that they weren't given choices and they weren't giving consent within their relationships because there was a threat of violence hanging over their heads. So definitely we will partner with DV agencies where needed, because one great thing we wish we had, but we don't, is a shelter. That is a hugely important thing. So thank you all so much for those wonderful questions. We're going to have time for more later. So my next piece is how COVID-19 has impacted the sexual and domestic violence community and how BARCC and Junior League Boston can support both. I'm actually going to go ahead and, if it's okay, throw that question into the chat because I think it's a really, really good one. And I just want to make sure everybody, helpful for me too. I don't want to get into I don't want to go off on a tangent. So how has COVID-19 changed this movement? I think it's honestly made services more accessible for more people, made volunteering more open to more people. There's a lot of it that has been incredible because you hear folks say, I never could have come to get therapy. I never could have come to meet with a legal advocate if you weren't doing this work remotely. And we had talked in the past about doing remote counseling or doing remote legal advocacy. And we just never did because so much can come up during sessions. It always seemed to us that it was really important to be face-to-face, have that communication and connection with the person you're working with, and also be there in case safety concerns came up. We all work with a lot of folks who are in really dangerous situations and also folks who might be a danger to themselves. And so being there in the moment to be able to intervene if someone was triggered or really upset or just support them felt really important. And I think it still is. And I think this will be a debate that will go on for a long time within these fields. But I absolutely can say that COVID has forced DV and rape crisis centers to make their services remotely accessible. And that has made accessing services a lot easier for a lot of different people. I would say also that, however, another impact is that while we know from the amount of volume on the hotline that people are still being harmed, steps that folks are taking perhaps to remove themselves from situations or get support outside of a remote hotline, a lot of folks aren't taking those steps. A lot of folks are not leaving dangerous living situations because where will they go? A lot of folks are not going into hospitals, as I mentioned earlier, because hospitals are a place where probably would presume it would be pretty easy to pick up COVID-19. A lot of folks are not going into police stations or meeting with attorneys because they're really just, I think a lot of folks are also just really focused on getting through the pandemic, or already dealing with a certain degree of trauma from the cultural trauma we're all going through, from being isolated, dealing with the anxiety, dealing with the stress, dealing with perhaps children at home, parents or yourself who might be dealing with serious illness or ongoing side effects. So I think, unfortunately, there are definitely a lot of people who are not getting the support that they need right now. And I think in the years to come, we'll get a better picture of exactly what was happening in terms of domestic and sexual violence in America during the COVID-19 pandemic. Because again, I just think a lot of folks are not getting the same kind of supports or removing themselves from dangerous situations that they were in the past. We really haven't seen, based on the volume that we're seeing on our hotline and within other services, we're not seeing less sexual violence happening across the board. So how BARCC and JL Boston can support both the domestic violence and rape crisis movement, I would say some of the biggest ways are by doing what you're already doing and educating yourselves about the resources that are in your area. I really, really love to get to come and give a talk like this and get to really explain what those services might look like. I'm happy to get into as much detail as you all would like, because even when because we know that most folks don't actually reach out to a rape crisis center first when they've been sexually assaulted or when they are experiencing domestic violence. They reach out to someone they care about. They reach out to a friend, a partner, a parent, somebody who's close to them. And just educating the community about what kind of resources are out there, I think, is so much of what we're about and what we really, really care about. And the other piece that I would say is volunteerism. Again, just volunteering the way you do. We've had great JL volunteers at galas and walks for change in the past, because those things are all remote now. Hopefully that will go back to in-person in 2022. But that kind of event volunteerism is incredibly helpful. And also, again, just letting folks know about those kinds of opportunities and putting them out there is incredible, because we need all the support that we can get. We cannot function for one day without the volunteer corps that we have currently and the support that we've gotten from the outside community in terms of event volunteerism, donations, requests for trainings like this. All of that, I would say, those are just incredible ways to support both the domestic violence community and rape crisis centers. There's not a lot of standalone rape crisis centers in America, which is funny to say. A lot of them are rolled into DV centers. So I'm really glad Boston's got a more specific resource like this, like BARCC. And it's something that we want to preserve and keep going, because we've definitely seen the services that the volunteers primarily staff, like the hotline, those have been the services that have really, really been there for survivors the most throughout the pandemic in particular. It's really, really changed so much about what we do. All right, so we're about halfway through. Now it's time for some more breakout questions. I would love to hear if anybody's got any more questions about BARCC, what we've been seeing throughout the pandemic, what we might have been hearing from some of our domestic violence colleagues at different shelters and areas. I would be delighted to answer. All right, great. Does BARCC receive any state funding? Yes, we do. We receive a really big grant from the Department of Public Health. And I would say right now that's probably constituting about maybe 30% of our budget, something like that. And we have a budget of right around 3 million right now. And then there's also a myriad of other grant funding that funds certain positions throughout BARCC. And then there's also private donations that individuals make and the money that gets raised during fundraisers. But yeah, we do get a good chunk of state funding, which is really what makes it possible for our services to be free. Well, we definitely sometimes charge, if MIT reaches out and wants us to, no shade to MIT, but if MIT wants us to train 200 RAs, we might ask for a donation in exchange for dozens of hours of staff time. But we never, ever, ever charge anyone who's reaching out to receive legal advocacy, case management, counseling, medical advocacy. None of those services are ever charged for. So that's really what makes BARCC possible. That's, I think, our ultimate goal is to never, ever, ever. Something I think that is just a real bedrock of what we do is that we're never going to be charging survivors. And we're not going to bill insurance either, because also right now we just don't know how to. But I think it also just gets you into a whole other, we want our services to always be free. All right, another great question. What divides a sexual assault specific center from one that misses sexual assault to domestic violence support? Well, what do I think? I think that what I hear from colleagues who work at DV centers, or the sexual assault division of the DV center, is that they sometimes feel like their work is really an afterthought. I'd say the actual difference is that most of those centers are just hugely, the DV and SA centers that combine are often really massive with really big budgets, because a lot of that money is going towards housing, which is a great thing for money to go towards. But I think that having the real difference between the way that it's done in the Boston area, where there's the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center, and then there's also some fantastic organizations like Respond and Casa Mirna that work on domestic violence issues. I think that it's really important to recognize that folks really respond differently in so many ways, to those two different forms of violence. People are often have different problems, different concerns, that they're looking for different supports. They have different kinds of questions a lot of the time. A lot of the training, I think, in supporting someone who's experiencing domestic violence and someone who's experienced sexual violence, that can sometimes look different. So I would definitely say that having the model where we're supportive of each other, but we're different centers, is really, really useful. So you alluded to the fact that volunteer calls have not gone down. Have the number of cases increased during COVID, and has the type of case changed within the pandemic state? I don't think I can speak with any certainty as to the type of cases. I would say again that most of the calls that we receive, we know from research that most of the sexual violence that's done is not done by a stranger. It's done by somebody who survivors know and trust. And I have not seen that change. That's really where we get a lot of our phone calls from, are folks who have been harmed by somebody who they knew and trusted, and are trying to cope with that as much as the fallout and the trauma of the act of sexual violence that was done to them. I don't know that if I could say that the number of cases has increased, but based on, again, the volume that we're hearing from our hotlines and folks reaching out for counseling, especially, I don't think that it's decreased. I feel like there was a lot of talk about, robberies are gone down and there's less violence happening because people are staying at home more and people are, in their bubbles more. And I can't speak for, if that's what statistics say, that's what they say. But again, what we're hearing from survivors is that they just are not interacting with the same kind of systems that they used to, because again, they might be scared to go into a hospital, don't want to go into a police station, don't want to be exposed to more people because of the fear of COVID, and also because it's difficult to do under any circumstance, much less with a pandemic hanging over one's head. I think a lot of folks are trying to deal with stuff on their own and pushing it to the back and getting through this really challenging time in our culture. There's another great question. Oh, thank you for this very nice comment, Ashley. I'm so glad you're finding this informative. Is there any instances during which you might have to turn a victim away that exceeded the number of sessions a counselor able to offer, for example? And what is the area of greatest need for BARCC? Great. So the first question is that I've never seen us turn someone away who is still in need. For sure, we will often tell people that we will tell people, not often, is that we do short-term counseling. So it's true that we don't say to folks, we'll be your therapist from now until 10 years from now. But it's usually very clear when someone comes in, if they're looking for a few sessions, which is common. Again, we're a crisis center. Folks might just want to be getting through a crisis. Or if they're looking for something longer term. And if they're looking for something longer term, that's when we can work, especially with case management. If they don't have insurance, let's figure out how to get them some insurance so we can get them connected with someone who's got expertise, one, in working with folks who've experienced sexual violence and are trauma informed, and two, will take whatever insurance they might have. And we have some really great partnerships. One that we're always looking for, speaking of area of need, is we're always looking for more partnerships with trauma-informed psychiatrists. That's something I'd love for us to be able to offer at BARCC. There are a lot of survivors who are dealing with panic attacks, sleeplessness, all these effects of PTSD, and also folks who want to go on antidepressants, who want to get some kind of psychiatric help. And that's something that we currently don't offer. Again, we can figure out referrals, but it's something that we don't have. And I wish we did. Sorry, I wanted to get back. So I don't think we would really ever turn somebody away. I guess sometimes, though, just to be clear, sometimes folks are asking us for stuff that we can't do. Great example is that sometimes people will reach out and say, my partner was sexually abusing our children, and I need a lawyer to help me take them away from my partner. I don't want my children exposed to them. We can again figure out a referral, but we don't have divorce lawyers, on staff. That's just not something that we could do. So we'd have to figure out another resource. Some folks might say, I need housing for the night. We don't have a shelter. I wish we did. But we'd have to connect them with someone else. So I would say we'd never turn someone away who needed support, but we might have to make a referral to someplace else if we're just not the right resource. All right, great. Are there any, and then an area of greatest need? Again, I'd love to see us have some psychiatric help. I'm sure just like every nonprofit in the world, we wish we could have a bigger staff. We have a lot of jobs right now that we're looking to fill. We had a big staff exodus at the end of the summer, which has been tough on everybody. And so I think that's really our next area of great need. And I would also say something that we need is to do more of what I'm doing, what you're all giving me the opportunity to do here tonight. I really, really appreciate getting to talk to folks. So if there's another place or a place where maybe you work or another place where you volunteer or go to school and you think that you think that hearing from BARCC or getting a training from BARCC could be useful for that kind of organization, you're always, always welcome to reach out. And I'll be sure to leave my email address at the bottom so that everybody can have my info in case you'd like to reach out a little more. All right, thank you. So you mentioned volunteers must be over 18. Do you have a minimum age for the people you help? So I actually should correct myself. There is a small team, and they're more like interns. They are stipended, but there is a team of teens called the Youth Leadership Corps that's run by one staff member at BARCC, not by me. It's somebody who specializes in working with youth. And the Youth Leadership Corps works on different projects and brings them back to their schools. So they might learn how to give a training and then go and present it to their classmates, or they might work on like an anti-violence PSA for their school or a consent training and then bring it back to their school, a club they're involved in, their community, something like that. So there are some youth volunteers. And for events also, I've had plenty of young kids show up with their parents to, like wave a flag at the Walk for Change. That's all fantastic. But rape crisis counselors have got to be 18 plus. That's a state requirement. The people we help, we don't serve survivors who are 11 and younger. So 12 and up can receive any and all of our services. 11 and younger, we would refer to the Child Advocacy Center, which works out of Boston, which works out of the Family Justice Center, same building we have offices in Allston, pretty close to Boston University. So not too far from downtown Boston and accessible by train and parking around there and all that stuff. So there is another place for kids that young. I will say that we definitely serve, though, a lot of parents of kids who are that age. So they may have case management needs or legal advocacy questions in particular as pertains to the abuse that their child suffered. And we would certainly work with those parents, but we wouldn't be clinicians for someone who was 11 or younger. We would find a referral for that child. Do you have volunteers or staff members who specialize in working with the LGBTQ community? That's a part of the 40-hour training. So I would like to think that we all have expertise. It's definitely, there's a lot of the staff that identifies as a part of that community and are incredible. And we've learned a lot from in terms of how we support that community. I would say too, though, that I've learned a lot from my colleagues at the Network Low Red. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that, but that's an agency that specializes in working with LGBTQ plus individuals who've experienced sexual or domestic violence. They also work out of the FJC, coincidentally. So we get to walk down the hall and check in with them. They've supported us in many trainings that we've written. They've presented trainings to our volunteers and to our staff through the years. So again, I hope that we've all taken on some of that knowledge. We all want to go out and be the best rape crisis counselors that we can be, no matter what our role, if we're working in development, if we're working in finance, or if we're, a clinical social worker. It's important for everybody to be on the same page and have knowledge. But I would say that, yeah, again, there are a couple of staff like Jenny Prater, Lee Doyle, Molly Nyland, who have really brought a lot of expertise around working with the LGBTQ community, and who present specifically some trainings on the LGBTQ community. Do many survivors of assault by intimate partners seek help from your agency? Definitely. Though I will say again, something that I hear and see a lot more is folks reaching out many years later, in particular when maybe they're in a different relationship than their abusive relationship, and they feel like their enjoyment of sex with this new partner is really being damaged by the pain that was caused by the old partner. And it's, again, more of a slow realization, because I think our culture teaches us, right, that rape is somebody screaming no, getting grabbed from the bushes. And I think the reality is that there are a lot of non-consensual situations that can happen within abusive relationships. And I think that takes a long time for a lot of people to reconcile, and carries a lot of pain for a lot of individuals, of all genders, by the way. It's something that I've spoken to folks of all genders about. So for sure, there are people who reach out to get services, but again, we rarely see it in the immediate aftermath of the assault. It's often somebody reaching out to get support a lot later. And there's no statute of limitations for when you can get support from BARCC. People call us for assaults that happened sometimes minutes ago, or people might reach out for an assault that happened 50 plus years ago. And it really doesn't matter to us. It just matters to us how that person is feeling and if we can help them. What budget would you say you need to build a shelter? Great question. I want to say I really don't know. It's a great question. I think it would be dependent on so many factors, like where it would be, and where it would be located, if it would be for families, for individuals. I know there are shelters around Boston that function in all different ways. There's the Pine Street Inn, and then there's the Casa Mirna shelter, and they just function differently. And that's okay. But I would for sure love to see, and I can honestly see us more than even just starting our own shelter, trying to partner with a place like Casa Mirna, for example, to see if we could find a way to have some housing specifically for sexual assault survivors. Because again, I think shelters for sexual assault survivors can be really scary places. It's scary for anybody, but we know that survivors of sexual violence really feel nervous. They feel scared to go into a hospital and be made that vulnerable, getting that kind of care, then sleeping someplace they can't control, possibly around people that they don't know, is something really, really intimidating and frightening. It's a great question, how much money we would need. And if we ever decide to make the dream a reality and start doing a drive, I'm sure it will be all over social media what the goal is for what we're looking for. All right. Oh, thank you. And I also have a wonderful note from somebody who might have some resources for us. So thank you so much. All right, wonderful. So I'd love to hear again, we're in our last 15 minutes or so. I'm wondering if there are any things, you're all volunteers, you're all people who are really passionate about helping your community. I'm wondering if there are any things that you all would feel like would be useful to do to support survivors, to support agencies like BARCC. Are there any things that are popping into your mind that we should be thinking about that we potentially are not doing that maybe we could?
Hi, Megan, can you hear me?
Hi, I can perfectly.
Making dinner and the kids are here and my husband's working late again. But question for you on, let's see, I guess other organizations that maybe you haven't reached out to. Have you been working with a bunch of university alumni chapters that might not be Boston based, but have a large alumni following? And the reason I'm asking everybody on this call probably knows that I'm also part of the University of Texas at Austin, Boston chapter.
Yeah.
And we've got close to 2,000 people on our listserv. It keeps growing, and we're serving the entire New England network now instead of just Boston. And we're always looking for organizations to partner with, to help raise awareness, to help out, to volunteer. But then we also eventually want to do a paid speaker series to help bring in people like psychiatrists or actors or people in the high tech field who can come in and really share their expertise with the Boston area. So that's kind of where my head's at, is not only am I part of the Junior League, but I'm also part of this other organization, and I'm networking with other presidents and high level alumni, people like Vanderbilt and Marriott and all that kind of stuff, where those resources might help you guys even further.
That's actually, I think, a fantastic idea. I don't think we have any inroads with alumni around the city at all. We have a really hard time keeping up with our own volunteer alumni. That's one of my great passions, is to have like a BARCC volunteer alumni corps, so that we can have a party with them every year, get together, see how they grow. So many of them go into this field. But I think it's such a great point that so many BARCC folks who've sought services from BARCC, folks who've maybe been harmed, unfortunately, maybe during a time in college, we know is something we hear from a lot of survivors.
Not necessarily college, but in a professional environment. So
okay, yeah. I think that for sure it could be a really, really helpful group to reach out to train more, to see if folks be interested in volunteering, all those different pieces. So thank you. That's a great idea.
And to make sure that, like, it just keeps getting safer, so that if you want to go out with your girlfriends, like, you should be able to get home just fine. Like, you should be able to go out and network at a work event and not feel intimidated and cornered and that kind of stuff. So I'll get your contact information and shoot you an email maybe at the end of this. But I think that would be a good strategic partnership for you to look at for BARCC as a whole. Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you. I just dropped my work email.
I'm going to get back to cooking dinner, so I'm going to go back on not video, but I just wanted to share that.
Well, thank you so much. I think that's a really great thing to think about.
Sure.
I think one of the hardest things is getting your organization's name known, says Anastasia. Couldn't agree more. I feel like we've been around forever, and we're still like, oh, I didn't know that you guys existed, from so many people we wish knew existed, knew that we existed. And then connections with Boston-based women's organization potentially provide more funding. For sure, there are a lot of it. We have a good relationship with the Women's Center, which is right around which is right on the corner from really our main offices in Boston. We've done trainings, I know, for different women's leadership organizations. I know that we also work really hard in my department, in the outreach department, to try to make sure too that we're reaching men's organizations as well, ones that are specifically for men. Because I think I think we get painted a lot as a women's issue, but we don't see women doing a lot of this violence. The vast majority of the violence we hear about being done is being done by cis men. Not that there aren't people of all genders who commit acts of violence. But when we're trying to do bystander trainings, responding to disclosures training, supporting survivors trainings, I feel like often when I'm presenting to a group of women, it's wonderful, because I think people really understand what this work is all about. I think folks really feel deeply the need for this kind of work, is a sense I get from so many places that I get to present to that are largely female. But I would also say that, I want to make sure, but when I'm talking to groups of men, I often don't get that same feeling. So I really like to be in those kinds of spaces. And I like for BARCC to be in those spaces, because I feel like those spaces really need it too. What is the available accounting in languages other than English? What a great question. We have several Spanish speaking counselors. That is by far the most requested language that we get besides English. So we have got Spanish speaking attorneys, case managers, and clinicians, Spanish speaking hotline counselors, Spanish speaking medical advocates. And if there isn't someone who's available at the time, if this person needs to meet at 3 on a Tuesday and we don't have someone who's a Spanish speaking counselor available, we do have translation services that of course we'll provide for free based on whatever that person wants. There's also we have some really great partnerships, like for example, the network LARED, I'll say again, they have LARED means the network in Spanish. So they are a fully bilingual agency. So I've referred a lot of folks over there. I've referred folks to MAPS, the Massachusetts Alliance of Portuguese Speakers. They send their advocates through our training all the time. So they've got some good groundwork in being a sexual violence prevention counselor, a rape crisis counselor. So that's really useful. ATASC is a great organization that works with folks who identify as Asian and who've experienced domestic violence. But again, we'll give a lot of training to their staff so that they can provide support, clinical, legal, whatever, but provide it in the appropriate language, because of course, speaking through an interpreter can be really useful in a pinch, but in terms of developing that sort of long-term relationship, it's obviously better for somebody to be speaking the language that the survivor is most comfortable with. But right now, our capability for providing services in Spanish is actually really good. And we have a few other languages represented as well. Do you work with health centers and women's centers on Boston College campuses? And might that be a worthwhile partnership to look into? I've done a few things with Boston College. And I know we've taken a lot. I think we've got right now a couple of interns from there, which is great. I don't know if we're affiliated with the Women's Center though. So you're right. I think that thinking about that would be a great idea.
Megan, sorry.
Please.
I meant just like general, like Boston area university. Like,
of course. I was thinking to myself, I'm like, I think Alina's from BC actually. Oh. I was just meeting with one of the clinical interns a little while ago, and I'm like, I think that's actually her school. Good point. Yes, definitely. We have a lot of relationships with Boston College campuses. I would say those are the groups that reach out to us for training and support the most. I also think that, there's something called the Clery Act that's back from the 90s. I don't know if anyone's familiar, but it requires college campuses to track acts of violence on their campuses. A lot of campuses, we won't say which, but a lot of campuses were just not doing that for a long time. So that was something that BARCC tried to work really hard on, and there's a lot of student advocacy as well. Also, I'm sure everyone's heard of Title IX, which is around gender equity on campuses. So schools got under a lot more pressure to provide adequate services around what they were calling gender-based violence. I, again, am kind of hopeful someday we'll be able to move beyond some of these terms, because I do really see folks being harmed all across the gender spectrum, which is really sad. But I'd like to just acknowledge that there are survivors of all genders and they all deserve support, no matter what. But definitely we get a lot of support from those college campuses, with folks reaching out, wanting to get trainings, and also wanting to get counseling for their students, because there are clinicians who work on those campuses who just don't feel comfortable providing those services, even though Title IX maybe says that they must, but we don't want anyone to feel forced into that, or like they don't have the supports they need. So we'll also take into trainings clinicians from all over the city. We've done in the past paid 40-hour trainings that are geared just towards the clinical community or towards a professional community of college administrators. We know if you work at a college and you're working in the library, or you're working in the bursar's office, somebody could disclose to you that they've been sexually assaulted. And so we want everybody in those environments with young people to have resources to refer young people to, and also have some skills to respond. That feels really, really critical for us. All right, thank you so much. I took notes on everything you guys said, and I saved email addresses where they were. This has been really, really fun and helpful. I'm so appreciative again of the conversation that we've gotten to have tonight. Are there any final questions or anything at all that you all would like to know, maybe facilitators, anything you're hoping that I could share in our last few minutes that you think would be useful for the Junior League to be aware of?
Megan, do you guys offer single day volunteer opportunities?
We do. When we're back in person, which I would say is going to be spring 2022, so a few months from now, we will definitely be putting out our Walk for Change volunteer opportunities. Please know, if we're back in, lockdown mode and we can't all be in person by next spring, I will cry. I miss it. The Walk for Change is an incredible event. You can volunteer at it. And also a hugely helpful thing to do is just to post about it and let people know it's happening. It's pretty cheap to sign up. I think it's like early registration is $15 usually, $30, I think, for main registration. Don't quote me on that. I don't know what development's going to do. They might go up, they might go down, but that's usually around like the point where we're at. And there are all different things you can do. It's outside for sure. There's all different things you can do. It's accessible to folks with any kind of accessibility need. It's a fully accessible walk. That's a commitment. So it's accessible for volunteers as well. And that's a really fun day. I remember the last time I got to work with a crew of Junior League volunteers was at the gala in November of 2019. And that was a lot of fun. We did that at the Copley Marriott, I want to say. We were downtown. No, we were at the Westin. And we were in the big ballroom. We had some great Junior League volunteers who were there helping us pass out programs, push people, get people going in the right direction, directing people as they when they inevitably would get lost and wander into somebody else's gala. So that's a really fun single day volunteer opportunity that I hope will come back in the future. I think though that the future of the big gala is something that I know we've talked about a long time. So we'll see if we hang on to it, but I don't think the Walk for Change will ever go anywhere. That is, as much as it's a fundraiser, is an event for the community. And people come out. Some folks choose to identify that they're survivors with beads, which is an incredible thing to see. We hear from survivor speakers. We heard many years in a row from Ayanna Pressley. I don't know if we can get Ayanna anymore. Ayanna was such a star. But Congress Representative Pressley has been a longtime supporter of BARCC and is amazing. And that's a spectacular one-day event. Oh, thanks. I'm so glad. Oh, I love that you guys comment about the gala. I'm glad that it felt amazing because, they put a lot of work into that. I'm so glad to know that, again, these are resources I wish the whole world could know about. I'm so grateful to get the opportunity to go in more depth with them. So to all of you, so thank you so much for that. Again, it was just fantastic to meet you. I'll put my email in here one more time. So if there are any final questions that come up, if anyone's got volunteer questions for me, if anyone's got anything at all that they're wondering about, please don't hesitate to reach out. I would love to talk to you.
Thank you, Megan, so much. This was wonderful.
My pleasure. Oh, thank you though so much. I really appreciate it.
And if any other questions come my way too, I'll let you know and connect you. But thank you again, everyone. Have a good night. And thanks, Megan.
My
Bye.
pleasure. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks.